I don't know if I'm gonna need the whole 8 minutes because this research is this research is already over. It's actually coming to an end in December 2021. I only would want to do one last port, which is Belfast, but depending on how COVID goes. But we have so it's already been covered. The other ports have already been covered, which are Genova, Melbourne, Montreal, New York, Liverpool. And the reason for that is because we wanted to look at ports with commercial ports, important ones in the area where they are on, but also very important cities behind. So the interesting part of this research was actually to look at the port and the intersection with the city from an organized crime perspective. So the ports are also coming out of a decision that I made very early on about my own overlapping interest. On one side, mafia research, and on the other side, cocaine based, let's say, trafficking, cocaine trade. And so these ports seem to be most interesting also because of that. So the interesting part about researching ports is that you get sucked into a never-ending complicated set of knowledge. So first of all, you need to figure out very early on what kind of approach you're going to have to port. So port can be looked in terms of space from many different angles, especially from a local angle and a global angle, but also in terms of access, of the way their physical territory is shaped, the way they are also a social environment and the economic setting. So the space of the port has been pretty much the main, the most important contribution to the theoretical framework that we have managed to give through this research, especially because and I say we because we've written a book that I'm going to show you in a moment. We wanted to look at the ways in which the space and the environment, with all that it means, the environment shapes crime in the port at both local and global levels. So ports are gates, doors, and barriers. So obviously studying access to the local environment of the port means looking at the barriers primarily, but also ports are a shipping hub. So from an access perspective, they don't have any type of barrier when it comes to commerce. At the same time, when we look at physical territory, the port is an inward border, so it does act as a border towards the city, sometimes towards the whole region or the nation as well. So they are the first point of entry into a nation, but they also act as outward border from a perspective of the sea. So they are the first arrival point from the sea. And the way this is actually organized might change eventually the perception of the port and the criminality in the port. As a social territory, at the local level, ports are spaces for relationship across private and public sectors. The relationship between private and public sectors in the port is actually, its actually own specialism. So studies about security networks in ports are very much the most developed angle of this whole story. But on a global level, let's say, ports are spaces for international governance, as I've been told many times. Is probably where capitalism is the most successful. The port economy is probably the most excellent manifestation of capitalism, of successful capitalism. In terms of economic settings, of course, the port attracts at the local level investments and employment. So the workforce is usually locally based. Investments in the port include infrastructures. It includes anything from catering to obviously management of waste and disposal, but also at the global level, the port is obviously, when we look at commercial ports, hubs for global trade. So they need to be looked at from this perspective. So this is the book that I mentioned, which is a 4-people effort, and it's a book that intersects political economy, criminology, economic sociology, and security studies. So essentially what we looked at wasn't just organized crime. I'm very much aware that the term organized crime is not the most appropriate when we look at port. So I prefer to look at complex crime, which could be illicit trafficking, could be illicit infiltration in the legal economy and extra-legal governance, and the ways in which this is investigated and policed. So again, the scheme is always the same, so I'm not going to go into this specifically, but there is, let's say, in a very simplified manner, there is a lot of data on illicit trafficking, but the more you grow into infiltration in the legal economy and extra-legal governance, the more the data seems to be fading away. And this is interesting when you look at it's a completely different perspective. So you have more data on cross-border illicit trade rather than local corruption and local cartels, let's say, of private interest. So criminal activities in port, as I said, are complex crimes because of the complex nature of the port. Obviously, trafficking almost always looks at drug networks, while infiltration almost always looks at coalitions and cartels of private-public corruption, especially in the sector of construction and public contracts. And when we look at extra-legal governance, so the type of mafia-type groups influence over unions or ports, some of you might remember the history of the Port of New York being particularly important in this case. So looking at power ties and political interest around the authority of the port as forms of systemic corruption. As I said, a lot of data on trafficking, especially drugs, but not just drugs, less and less in infiltration and governance. So this is just a snapshot of my pilot port, which was Genova, and systemic and occasional criminal actors and activities by criminal actors in the legal wards and the illegal wards as well. And you see that there is so much more than just transnational organized crime. There is a lot to say about occasional participation, especially port workers, border force corruption, and obviously big scale corporate crime, including waste disposal, which in some cases it has been particularly relevant. When we look at Brexit, this is the last bit of the research that I'm still looking at, and that's a snapshot. Brexit poses particular risk profiles, but the best part of this is that we won't know until we actually enter the Brexit custom agreements that we keep postponing. So we still don't know what's the actual meaning of any of this risk profile. But the ones that I've been able to identify have to do with maritime policing. So shipping routes are changing. There is an Irish sea border, whatever the government says, and this sea border is affecting the routes into the UK through Ireland. And this means that the UK will also have new boundaries for policing its own water. And I do see a particularly risk, a vulnerability in the policing of crimes at sea, especially waste and illegal fishing and maritime smuggling, because there wasn't already a capacity to do so before Brexit. So after Brexit, I think this will be quite a big stretch. And again, we don't have data on this. Small boats and small ports, we already know that there is an increased use of small boats, especially yacht and personal vessels and ferries for illicit trades. We already know anecdotically of increased small illicit trade between Northern Ireland and Scotland for the purposes of avoiding customs. Drugs regional distribution is bound to change due to that. But at the same time, container shipping is not decreasing and is still moving north towards Antwerp and Rotterdam. So this is going to pose an increased pressure on the East Coast ports, especially Felixstowe and the likes on the side, but at the same time it's going to create a fragmentation and atomization of the distribution channels from mainland Europe into the UK to try and avoid essentially the normal route. Because that would be a problem if a container that is expected to carry drugs is held at border controls, not for intelligence and policing assessment, but for customs problems. Smaller ports are to be looked at because they're already under pressure for the new customs requirements. There was some, again, media coverage about their not being ready, their general level of unpreparedness, and potentially this will lead to mismanagement, laissez-faire attitude, or even increased corruption, as the NCA has already profiled. Port security, which already in itself is not meant to tackle organized crime, but terrorism. And it's a massive issue in the UK because the UK is characterized by the private nature of its port, differently from most of the rest of the world. And this is a problem for data retention and data sharing. So we don't actually know how most ports in the UK are ensuring security within their own territories. Plus, this is bound to create yet another issue with the criminogenic nature of free ports. We went back to free ports after 10 years of not having free ports, and the free ports that we are going to have are the main ones, the main ports, where obviously we need to eventually study what's that's going to be like, especially in, as I said, with big ports such as Liverpool or Felixstowe. The Irish border and the Irish ports, as I said already, unpreparedness of new customs regulations. This is going to create pressure on the mainland, on essentially on the land border across the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Is already creating problems, and it's going to pose problems in terms of raising of the profile of local criminal groups. We've already read in the past months, I've been particularly interested in looking at some of the new trends in Irish organized crime, which seem to point in this direction. The different Northern Ireland and Irish regimes of customs from mainland Britain, again, are going to push for increased traffic to Ireland and possibly to the land border. An outlook, eventually, as I said, security performance gap between large and small ports is probably the one that should be tackled very soon. We've seen large seizures on the shores of Cornwall in the past months, which might or might not come from other ports. So the shipments of cocaine might have been destined to other ports. This is particularly important to identify what kind of diversification of deviance is happening at this stage, and displacement as well. The custom regimes, I'm not quite clear now when they're coming into place, the full set of new rules. So again, that's something that is still ongoing, and while it is ongoing, it's going to create displacement to land. It might create displacement to land borders and possibly rising violence. The changing landscape of policing and judicial cooperation with the EU, we only retain Siena and CC, but CIS2, but obviously that is not enough when it comes to the immediacy of the resources. And the new maritime borders and the exploitation of waters for criminal activities, again, is something that in terms of capacity is still quite unclear whether there will be more capacity to tackle this. I spoke really quick, so I hope this is clear enough. If it's not, let me know.